October 1974. The Gulf of Alaska doesn't forgive, and it certainly doesn't forget. It is a place where the water is the color of a bruised lung, and the wind screams with the voices of 1,000 drowned men. But on this particular Tuesday, the air over Orca Bay was unnervingly still. A thick, suffocating blanket of fog had rolled in from the Aleutians, swallowing the horizon whole. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a weight pressing against your eardrums. Captain Elias Miller of the Coast Guard cutter Ironwood stood on the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped the brass railing. His eyes were fixed on the radar screen. A rhythmic, ghostly blip was pulsing on the phosphor-green display. A vessel, dead in the water, no radio contact, no distress signal, just a shadow drifting in the gray void. "Bridge to deck," Miller's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy boot. "Prepare a boarding party. We found her. We found the Polar Star." The Polar Star was a legendary crabber, a rusted, steel-hulled beast that had survived the worst the Bering Sea could throw at it. But as the Ironwood drew closer, the silhouette that emerged from the fog didn't look like a ship anymore. It looked like a tomb. The boarding party's skiff cut through the icy black water, the small outboard motor sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. As they pulled alongside the Polar Star, the smell hit them first. It wasn't the smell of death, not yet. It was the smell of everyday life frozen in time. The scent of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the briny, metallic tang of king crab. Officer Sarah Vance was the first to swing her boots onto the slippery deck. The ship was rocking gently, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the hull hitting a stray piece of glacial ice. "Coast Guard, is anyone aboard?" she shouted. Her voice didn't echo. The fog just ate it. She clicked on her heavy maglite, the beam cutting a hole through the gloom. The deck was a chaotic mess of industry left mid-motion. Huge steel crab pots hung suspended from the hydraulic cranes, swaying like giant rusted skeletons in the wind. Hundreds of pounds of fresh catch, the red gold of the north, lay scattered across the deck. The crabs were still moving, their legs clicking feebly against the metal plates, but the men who had hauled them up were nowhere to be seen. Vance moved toward the galley. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, whining on its hinges with a high-pitched metallic shriek that set her teeth on edge. She pushed it open. Inside, the atmosphere was hauntingly domestic. A pot of beef stew sat on the stove, the burner still glowing a faint, dying red. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate, the bread dry and curled at the edges. A cigarette had burned all the way down to the filter in a glass ashtray, leaving a long, delicate column of gray ash that hadn't even been disturbed by a breeze. It was as if 12 grown men had simply evaporated into the Alaskan mist in the middle of their lunch. "Captain," Vance whispered into her radio, her breath coming out in white plumes. "The table is set, the stove is on, but the cabin, it's empty." She turned her flashlight toward the companionway leading down to the engine room. That's when she saw it. At the base of the metal stairs, reflecting the harsh light of her torch, was a smear of something dark and viscous. It wasn't oil. It was too thick, too deep a crimson. Following the trail, her hand landed on the heavy iron door of the ship's primary safe. The safe was wide open. Its heavy bolts were retracted, yawning like a mouth. And there, emblazoned across the cold gray steel, was the mark that would haunt Vance for the rest of her life. A single, perfect imprint of a human hand, rendered in drying blood. The fingers were dragged downward, as if whoever had left it was being pulled into the dark hold of the ship. There was no gold in the safe. Only a single, jagged shell from a deep-sea mollusk, sitting on the velvet lining like a cruel joke. In that moment, the wind shifted. The fog parted for a split second, revealing the jagged, black teeth of the coastline miles away. Vance realized then that the lifeboats were still in their davits. The survival suits were still in their lockers. There was nowhere for 12 men to go. No way to leave. The Polar Star hadn't been attacked by the sea. It had been consumed from the inside out. "Sir," Vance's voice trembled. "You need to get down here. They didn't leave. They're still here. Somewhere." As she spoke, a faint, rhythmic sound began to rise from the depths of the hull. Clang,
Clang, clang. It wasn't the ice. It was the sound of a metal wrench hitting a pipe deep in the flooded ballast tanks. A signal or a warning. In 1974, gold was worth $150 an ounce. But on the Polar Star, the price of gold was measured in souls, and the ocean was finally coming to collect its dead.
To understand what happened on the Polar Star, you have to understand the silence of the North. It isn't a peaceful silence, it's a predatory one. In the Gulf of Alaska, the air is so cold it feels like breathing in powdered glass. It coats your lungs with a thin film of frost, making every breath a conscious effort, a reminder that you are an intruder in a world that doesn't want you there. Imagine the smell. It's the first thing that greets a man when he steps onto a working crabber. It's a thick, suffocating cocktail of smells that never leaves your clothes, no matter how many times you wash them. It's the sharp, acidic sting of diesel fuel leaking from an old gasket, the heavy, cloying scent of hydraulic fluid, and the underlying permanent stench of rotting bait, herring and squid turning to gray mush in wooden crates. But over it all, there is the salt, a brine so concentrated it eats through solid steel, turning once strong railings into crumbling orange flakes of rust. Listen closely. A ship like the Polar Star is never truly quiet. It's a living, groaning creature made of iron and rivets. Even when the engines are dead, the hull speaks. It's the sound of the Bering Sea pressing against the half-inch steel plates, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrates in your marrow. It's the ghost-like whistle of the wind as it whips through the rigging, sounding like a woman humming a funeral dirge. And then there's the ice, the black frost that builds up on the masts, making the ship top-heavy and treacherous. When the ice cracks, it sounds like a bone snapping in the dark. Inside the galley, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the violence of the sea outside. Here the air was heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, the smell of burnt lard, stale tobacco smoke, and the lingering sweetness of cheap canned peaches. This was the sanctuary. This was where the 12 men of the Polar Star forgot about the freezing spray and the 100-foot drops into the abyss. On the table, a deck of tally-ho playing cards lay scattered. Some were stained with coffee, others with the grease from a mechanic's thumb. A transistor radio sat on a shelf, its dial stuck between stations, emitting nothing but a low, jagged hiss of static, the sound of the cosmos screaming through the northern lights. Beside it sat a tin of Prince Albert tobacco, the red metal rusted at the edges, and a stack of local newspapers from Juneau, their headlines already yellowed by the damp sea air. The lighting was always dim. The ship's generator flickered constantly, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to dance across the wood-paneled walls. The light wasn't white. It was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, the color of an old bruise. It made everyone look tired. It made everyone look guilty. In the 1970s, life on an Alaskan crabber was a cycle of extreme violence and extreme boredom. You worked 20-hour shifts until your hands were swollen and your fingernails bled, and then you collapsed into a damp bunk that smelled like another man's sweat. You lived for the payday, that one big haul that would let you go home and forget the ocean existed for a few months. But when they found that gold, the atmosphere changed. The smell of the salt and the diesel didn't matter anymore. The rhythmic groaning of the ship began to sound like a countdown. The yellow light of the galley didn't feel warm. It felt claustrophobic. Suddenly, the walls were too close. The smiles of your crewmates felt like bared teeth. The gold brought a new scent to the Polar Star, a cold, metallic scent, the smell of ancient coins pulled from a lightless grave. It was a scent that didn't belong in the 20th century. It belonged to the dead. And as the fog thickened outside, the men realized that they weren't just trapped on a ship in the middle of the ocean. They were trapped in a cage with a ghost that promised them the world, but demanded their blood in exchange. The North doesn't have a heartbeat. It has a clock. And for the men of the Polar Star, the clock had just struck midnight.
To the world, they were just names on a manifest. 12 men, 12 shadows in heavy coats, lost to the cold. Но напередодні зорі вони були сім'єю, не за кров'ю, а за шрамами. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the bond they shared. A bond forged in the blackest nights of the Bering Sea, where the only thing between you and eternity is the man standing next to you on the sorting table. The crew was led by Captain Elias Barnes. He was a man carved out of Alaskan cedar and salt, 60 years old, with skin like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too many storms and not enough sunlight. Barnes wasn't a man of words, he was a man of rhythm. He knew the heartbeat of the engine better than his own. He had spent 40 years pulling life from the freezing depths, losing 3 fingers to a snapping winch in '58, and his soul to the bottle after his wife passed in Sitka. The Polar Star was his church, and the crew were his reluctant disciples. Then there was Big Mike Grady, the first mate, a former logger from Oregon who fled north after a bar fight left a man paralyzed. Mike was the muscle, a giant of a man whose laughter could be heard over the roar of a gale. He was the one who kept the morale up when the ice was 6 inches thick on the deck and the crab pots were coming up empty. He and Barnes had a silent pact. Mike was the heart and Barnes was the iron. And you couldn't forget young Billy Vance. He was only 19, the youngest of the lot. He had a girl waiting for him in Anchorage and a Polaroid of her tucked into the visor of his bunk. Billy was the greenhorn, the one who did the dirty jobs, scrubbing the guts off the deck and greasing the rusted joints of the crane. The older man looked at him with a mix of pity and envy. He still had hope. He still believed there was a world outside the gray horizon. There were others, too. Old Tom, the cook, who had been a merchant marine in the Great War and walked with a limp that clicked on the metal floor. The Henderson twins, 2 silent Swedes who worked in perfect, haunting synchronicity, never speaking a word to anyone but each other. They were a machine of 12 parts, oiled by shared hardship and the singular goal of survival. They were men of the 1970s, hard men who didn't talk about their fears. They spoke in the language of tobacco brands, engine parts, and the price of a gallon of fuel. Their friendship wasn't built on conversations, it was built on 1,000 small acts of trust. Trusting that Mike would catch the swing of the crane. Trusting that Tom would have hot coffee ready at 3 a.m. Trusting that the man behind you wouldn't let you slip over the low railing into the 40-degree water. This was a brotherhood of iron. They had survived the great gale of '72 together, huddling in the galley as 70-foot waves threatened to snap the ship like a dry twig. They had shared their last drops of whiskey and their deepest regrets in the dark. They were a tribe. But the North has a way of finding the crack in even the strongest hull. For these men, that crack wasn't a storm or a mechanical failure. It was the gold fever. You see, these men were tired. They were bone-deep, soul-achingly tired of the cold, the smell of fish, and the constant threat of a watery grave. They were men who had spent their lives working for pennies while the sea took its tax in blood. Underneath the camaraderie, there was a simmering resentment, a collective exhaustion. They weren't just fishing for crabs, they were fishing for an exit. They wanted out of the fog, out of the damp bunks, out of the endless cycle of debt and labor. When they looked at each other in the dim light of the cabin, they didn't see friends anymore. They saw witnesses. They saw obstacles. The brotherhood that had saved them from the ocean was about to become their prison, because the only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose is a man who suddenly has everything to gain. 12 men, 1 ship, and a secret that was about to turn their shared history into a map of betrayal. The ice wasn't the only thing hardening on the Polar Star. The hearts of the crew were turning to stone, 1 ounce of gold at a time.
It happened at 2:14 a.m. The graveyard shift. On a fishing boat, time doesn't exist in hours. It exists in hauls. The weather had turned foul. A biting, horizontal sleet was clawing at the exposed skin of the crew, and the Polar Star was pitching violently in a 6-foot swell. The deck was a treacherous skating rink of ice and fish slime, illuminated by the harsh, vibrating glare of the sodium floodlights. "Heave! Heave away!" Big Mike's voice boomed over the hydraulic whine of the main winch. The massive steel cable groaned under the tension, dripping with black grease as it coiled onto the drum. Slowly, out of the churning, frothing wake of the ship, the giant steel frame of the crab pot emerged. It was a heavy monster, dripping with kelp and tangled in ghost nets from a dozen different seasons. As it cleared the surface, the water cascaded off the metal mesh like 1,000 silver needles. The crane swung the pot over the sorting table. Billy Vance pulled the release lever. With a wet, heavy thud, the catch spilled out. It was a good haul. Hundreds of king crabs, their orange shells glistening, clicking their claws in a frantic, useless protest against the freezing air. But as the mud and the silt began to wash away under the high-pressure hoses, something caught the light. It wasn't the dull orange of a crab shell. It wasn't the silver flash of a salmon. It was a color that didn't belong in the Gulf of Alaska. It was deep, heavy, and impossibly yellow. "Hold it! Kill the lights!" Captain Barnes shouted from the bridge wing, though he didn't wait for the deckhands to react. He was already sliding down the metal ladder, his boots clanging on the rungs. There, nestled in a pile of kelp and crushed shells, lay a rectangular slab. It was about the size of a brick, but it sat in the muck with a weight that seemed to defy gravity. Barnes pushed past Billy, his hands trembling as he reached into the pile of clicking crabs. He didn't care about the sharp pincers drawing blood from his knuckles. He grabbed the object and hauled it up. It was a bar of gold. But it wasn't the clean, stamped gold of a bank vault. This was raw, ancient wealth. It was pitted and scarred, encrusted with barnacles and the calcified remains of sea creatures that had been dead for centuries. As Barnes wiped away the black mud with his sleeve, the sodium light hit the surface. The gold didn't just reflect the light, it seemed to soak it up, glowing with an inner warmth that made the freezing sleet feel 1,000 miles away. The crew gathered around the sorting table in a tight circle. No one spoke. The only sound was the heavy thrum of the engine and the distant, lonely cry of a foghorn. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on that single yellow brick. In that moment, the exhaustion that had been crushing their spirits for weeks simply evaporated. The pain in their joints, the salt sores on their necks, the longing for home, it all vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent electricity. Is that real, Cap?" Billy whispered, his voice cracking. Barnes didn't answer. He turned the bar over in his hands. On the underside, partially obscured by corrosion, was a faint mark, a stamped seal of a crown and a cross. A Spanish galleon. The Nuestra Senora, perhaps, or some other nameless ghost ship that had been claimed by the North Pacific centuries ago. He looked back into the sorting table. "Get the hoses back on," he commanded, his voice now a low, predatory growl. "There's more. I know there's more." They worked like men possessed. They didn't care about the crabs anymore. They kicked the expensive catch back into the sea or crushed them under their boots. They hauled the pots back up as fast as the winch could spin. One by one, the ocean gave up its secrets. Another bar, then a handful of hand-minted coins, then a rotted leather pouch that burst open to reveal a hoard of gold chains, their links tangled like a nest of vipers. By 4 a.m., the sorting table was covered in gold. It looked like a butcher's block made of sunbeams. The atmosphere on the deck had shifted. The brotherhood was gone. In its place was a group of strangers. They didn't look at the gold. They looked at each other, checking who was watching, who was counting, who was leaning too close. The gold was gold, but it had started a fire in the polar star that no amount of Alaskan water could put out. They had found the red gold of the Galleon, and in doing so, they had unburied a curse that had been waiting in the dark for 300 years. The sea had finally given them a payday, but the sea never gives anything for free.
The gold lay on the sorting table, a pile of silent yellow witnesses to a miracle. But in the cold light of the Alaskan dawn, the miracle began to feel like a threat. The crew stood frozen, their breath forming a collective cloud of steam in the air, their eyes darting between the treasure and the bridge where Captain Barnes stood. The air was no longer filled with the camaraderie of a successful haul. It was thick with the suffocating scent of a secret that was too big for 12 men to carry. Barnes looked down at the men from the bridge wing. He saw the greed reflected in their eyes, a mirror of the fire burning in his own gut. He knew the law. Maritime law was clear. A find of this magnitude had to be reported immediately to the Coast Guard. The vessel's position had to be logged, the salvage rights declared, and the government would inevitably step in to take their lion's share. By the time the lawyers, the historians, and the taxmen were done, these 12 men would be left with a handshake and a footnote in a local newspaper. "Cap?" Big Mike called out, his voice uncharacteristically thin. "We gotta call this in, right? We gotta tell Kodiak Station what we pulled up."
The word Kodiak acted like a bucket of ice water. The men shifted uncomfortably. They thought about their debts, the mortgages on houses they barely saw, the alimony payments, the bar tabs that never seemed to shrink. They thought about the years of breaking their backs for a sea that gave them nothing but salt and sorrow. Barnes didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked into the wheelhouse. The crew watched through the salt-crusted windows as he approached the radio console. This was the moment. If he picked up that handset, their lives would return to normal. They would be heroes for a day and poor for the rest of their lives. Inside the bridge, the green light of the radio's frequency display flickered. Static, hiss, pop. The world was waiting on the other side of that glass. Barnes reached out his hand, his fingers hovering over the dial. He thought about his retirement, the small cabin in the woods he'd never been able to afford, the quiet life away from the roar of the engines. His hand didn't grab the microphone. Instead, it moved to the heavy black toggle switch at the back of the unit. Click. The green light died. The rhythmic hiss of the static vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying silence. Barnes stepped back onto the bridge wing. "The radio's out," he lied, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "Internal short. Must have been the vibration from the last haul." He looked each man in the eye, challenging them to call him a liar. No one did. The lie was too beautiful to break. It was a bridge they were all crossing together, leaving the civilized world behind. "If we can't report it," Barnes continued, leaning over the railing, his shadow stretching long across the golden pile, "then officially it doesn't exist. Not yet. We finish the season. We head to a private dock I know in Juneau. We melt it down. We divide it 12 ways. No taxes, no government, no questions." A ripple of nervous energy went through the men. 12 ways. Even with a conservative estimate, each man was looking at more money than they would see in 10 lifetimes of crabbing. "What about the logbook?" someone shouted from the back. "I'll take care of the logs," Barnes replied. "As of this moment, the Polar Star is dark. No radio, no transponder, no logs. We are just 12 men on a boat in a fog. If anyone asks, we had a bad season. We hit a dry patch." "And the gold?" Billy Vance asked, his voice trembling. He was looking at the gold, but he was thinking about the girl in Anchorage. Would she love a rich man more than a fisherman, or would she be afraid of where the money came from? "The gold stays in my safe," Barnes said, and for the first time his voice had a sharp, territorial edge. "I keep the key. We don't touch it, we don't talk about it, and we don't look at it until we're tied up at the pier. Is that understood?" A slow, hesitant murmur of ICAP went around the circle. It wasn't a cheer of joy, it was a pact of silence. As the crew began to clear the deck, shoving the gold into heavy canvas sacks, the fog seemed to press in even closer. The Polar Star was no longer a fishing vessel. It was a ghost ship, severed from the rest of humanity by a single flick of a switch. They had cut the line to the world, and in doing so, they had let something dark and hungry on board. The first spark had been struck. The radio was dead, but the paranoia was just beginning to breathe. And in the silence that followed, every man on that deck began to wonder. If the gold is divided 12 ways, everyone is rich. No jak siowano podzielone na 11, albo na 10, then you aren't just rich, you are king. The fire was lit. Now they just had to wait for the wind to blow.
The gold was gone from the deck. The canvas sacks, heavy and clinking like the chains of a ghost, had been dragged into the captain's quarters and locked inside the heavy iron safe. But as the sun dipped below the leaden horizon of the Gulf, a new kind of darkness settled over the Polar Star. It was a darkness that didn't come from the sky, but from the corners of the men's minds. Inside the galley, the atmosphere was suffocating. Usually, after a big haul, the air would be filled with the boisterous sounds of victory, men shouting over each other, the clatter of forks against tin plates, the shared laughter of those who had looked death in the eye and won. But tonight, there was only the sound of metal on porcelain and the rhythmic, hollow thrum of the engine. 12 men sat around the long wooden table, but they had never been further apart. They ate in a tense, rigid silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, as if the mashed potatoes and canned peas held the secrets of the universe. No one wanted to be the first to speak. To speak was to acknowledge the elephant in the room. To speak was to admit that they were no longer a crew, but a group of co-conspirators. Big Mike Grady sat at the end of the table, his massive shoulders hunched, his hands, usually so steady, fumbling with a cigarette. He kept glancing at the ceiling,
toward the captain's cabin directly above them. He wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He was thinking about the lock. He knew that safe. He had helped install it 3 years ago. He knew it was strong, but he also knew that every lock had a weakness. And more importantly, he knew that the man holding the key was 60 years old and slept with a bottle of scotch by his bed. So, a voice cracked the silence. It was one of the Henderson twins. He didn't look up, his voice barely a whisper. What's the split, exactly? The question hung in the air like a hangman's noose. Captain Barnes, sitting at the head of the table, slowly put down his coffee mug. The steam rose in front of his face, masking his expression. "We talked about this," Barnes said, his voice low and dangerous. "Equal shares, 12 ways, after expenses." "Expenses?" The other twin chimed in, his eyes narrowing. "What expenses, Cap? The radio is broken. The logs are blank. There are no taxes, no dock fees, just us and the gold." "Fuel isn't free, and silence is even more expensive. We have to buy people when we get to Juneau. We have to grease the right palms to get that metal melted down without the feds sniffing around. You want your share? You let me handle the logistics." A cold, sharp edge of suspicion cut through the room. "Logistics," Mike muttered under his breath. "That's a fancy word for a captain's cut, isn't it?" The table erupted into a low, frantic murmur. The math of greed began to take over. If they gave Barnes more for expenses, they got less. And if one of them didn't make it back, if the sea claimed someone before they reached Juneau, then the remaining shares grew larger. It was a simple, brutal equation, one that every man in that room was secretly calculating, even as they pretended to be loyal. Billy Vance sat in the corner, his face pale. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had touched the gold only hours ago. They felt heavy. He felt the weight of the girl's Polaroid in his pocket, and for the first time it didn't bring him comfort. It felt like a target. If he had 1/12 of that gold, he was a rich man. But if he was the one who slipped off the deck in the middle of the night, his share stayed on the boat, and Mike or the twins or the captain would be that much richer. He looked around the table. He saw Big Mike's eyes. They weren't friendly anymore. They were calculating. He saw the twins whispering in Swedish, their eyes darting toward him. He saw old Tom, the cook, standing at the stove with his back to them, clutching a butcher knife a little too tightly as he chopped the onions. The trust that had taken years to build had been dissolved in a single afternoon by a pile of yellow metal. The Polar Star was no longer a sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker. The walls of the galley felt like they were closing in. Every creak of the ship's hull sounded like a footstep outside a cabin door. Every shadow looked like someone holding a crowbar. "Get some sleep," Barnes ordered, standing up abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. "We have a long run to Juneau, and remember, the safe is double-bolted, and I'm a light sleeper." As the men shuffled off to their bunks, no one said goodnight. They crawled into their damp blankets, but no one really slept. They lay there in the dark, listening to the breathing of the man in the bunk above them, listening for the sound of a key in a lock, listening to the cold, indifferent heart of the ocean beating against the side of the ship. The gold was in the safe, but the devil was already in the room, and he was just getting started. The third night after the find was when the fever finally broke into violence. The weather had turned into a screaming gale, a willy wall that swept down from the coastal mountains with the force of a freight train. The Polar Star was being tossed like a toy, her bow burying deep into the icy troughs before shuddering back up, shedding tons of seawater like a wounded whale. Inside the ship, the gravity of the gold had pulled everyone toward the center of the storm, the hallway leading to the captain's quarters. It started with a sound that shouldn't have been there, a metallic tink, 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 not the groan of the ship, but the rhythmic strike of steel against steel. Big Mike Grady wasn't in his bunk. Neither were the Henderson twins. They met in the narrow, dimly lit corridor, their shadows stretched long and distorted by the flickering overhead lights. Mike was holding a heavy iron pry bar, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He wasn't a thief by nature, but the math in his head had turned him into one. He didn't trust Barnes to share the gold, and he didn't trust the twins to let him live once they reached land. In his mind, The only way to survive was to take his share now and take his chances with the lifeboat. "Step aside, boys," Mike rumbled, his voice vibrating in his chest. "I'm just going in to check the inventory, making sure the cap hasn't started spending our futures." The twins didn't move. They stood side by side, blocking the path to Barnes' door. In the jaundiced light, they looked like reflections of each other, cold blue eyes fixed on Mike's throat. One of them held a long, curved gutting knife, the blade polished to a mirror finish. "Captain said no one enters," the first twin said, his voice flat. "Captain's drunk on scotch and greed," Mike spat. "Now move before I move you." The ship gave a violent lurch to the port side. The floor tilted at a 45-degree angle. In that split second of weightlessness, the tension snapped. Mike lunged forward, swinging the heavy pry bar in a wide, desperate arc. It whistled through the air, catching the second twin across the shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. A scream of agony was swallowed by the roar of the wind outside. The first twin didn't hesitate. He dived low, the gutting knife flashing in the dim light. He wasn't trying to scare Mike. He was working with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent his life butchering fish. The blade found its mark, slicing through the heavy wool of Mike's coat and into the meat of his thigh. Mike roared, a sound more animal than human, and slammed his massive fist into the twin's face, sending him reeling against the metal bulkhead. Suddenly, the door to the captain's cabin kicked open. Barnes stood there, his eyes bloodshot, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at the chaos in the hall. The smell of cheap scotch and gunpowder filled the cramped space. "Back off," Barnes screamed over the storm. "Back off, or I'll bury you both in the hold." The men froze. Mike was slumped against the wall, clutching his leg, blood, dark and thick as oil, seeping through his fingers and pooling on the linoleum floor. The twin was on the ground, spitting teeth and blood, his brother hovering over him with the knife still raised. "He tried to take the gold, Cap," the twin hissed, pointing at Mike. "He's a traitor." "I'm a traitor?" Mike laughed, a wet, choking sound. "You've been whispering in the dark for 3 days. You were going to kill us all. I saw it in your eyes." Barnes didn't lower the gun. He looked at the blood on the floor. It was a bridge they had all crossed. The brotherhood of the Polar Star was dead. There were no friends here anymore, only predators and prey. "Get him to the infirmary," Barnes commanded, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "And Mike, if I see you in this hallway again, I won't ask questions. I'll just pull the triggers." As the twins dragged Mike away, the blood trail left a jagged red line down the center of the ship. It was a map of what was to come. The first blood had been drawn, and the scent of it was driving the rest of the crew mad. Down in the galley, Billy Vance watched the red drops fall from the ceiling, leaking through the rivets from the floor above. He realized then that the gold hadn't just bought them wealth, it had bought them a ticket to a slaughterhouse, and the ship was still 500 miles from Juneau. The storm outside was screaming, but inside, the silence was even louder. The gold was safe in the safe, but the men were no longer safe from each other.
The air on the Polar Star had changed. It was no longer just the smell of salt and diesel. It was the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline and the cold, sour scent of fear. After the fight in the hallway, the ship fell into a state of armed neutrality. No one walked the corridors alone. No one turned their back on a door. Every man had become a fortress, locked inside his own mind, guarding a treasure he hadn't even touched yet. But the most dangerous place on the ship wasn't the captain's cabin or the blood-stained hallway. It was the galley. Old Tom, the cook, had always been the invisible man of the crew, a ghost in a stained apron who moved with a slight limp, serving up greasy bacon and gray stew without a word. He had seen 40 years of men breaking under the pressure of the sea, but he had never seen anything like this. He watched them from behind his serving counter, his eyes hidden behind thick, salt-crusted glasses, taking in every twitch, every hushed whisper, every hand that strayed toward a pocket. Tom knew the secret of the gold, but he also knew the secret of the ship. He knew that 12 men were too many for a lifeboat. He knew that the expenses Barnes talked about would eventually include the cost of a few accidental burials at sea. On this morning, the 5th day since the find, Tom was sharpening his knives. The sound, a rhythmic, hypnotic shh, shh, shh of steel against whetstone, echoed through the empty galley. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of Billy Vance's neck stand up as he walked in for a cup of coffee. "Morning, Tom," Billy whispered,
his voice barely audible over the hum of the stove. Tom didn't look up. He continued to stroke the long carving knife against the stone, his movements precise and mechanical. "The coffee's cold, boy," Tom said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Everything's cold on this boat now. Except the gold. The gold is always warm, isn't it? Like it's still got the blood of the Spaniards on it." Billy shivered. He reached for a mug, but his hand stopped midair. He noticed that the knife rack, usually full of heavy cleavers and paring blades, was half empty. The heavy butcher's knife was gone. The serrated bread knife was gone. "Where are the tools, Tom?" Billy asked, his heart beginning to drum against his ribs. Tom finally looked up. His eyes were vacant, reflecting the jaundiced yellow light of the overhead lamp. "The men came for them," he said simply, "one by one. In the dark. They said they needed them for repairs. But you don't repair a ship with a meat cleaver, do you, Billy?" The realization hit Billy like a wave of freezing water. The crew was arming themselves, under their bunks, inside their lockers, tucked into the waistbands of their oilskins. The Polar Star was now a floating arsenal of kitchen steel and sharpened marlin spikes. "The twins aren't eating anymore," Tom continued, turning back to his whetstone. "They think I'm putting something in the stew. They think I want their share. Everyone thinks everyone wants their share." He paused, the knife mid-stroke. "And they're right, aren't they?" Billy didn't answer. He backed out of the galley, leaving his coffee untouched. As he moved through the narrow companionway, he felt eyes on him from every shadow. He saw a door crack open an inch, then slammed shut as he passed. He heard the muffled sound of Big Mike Grady groaning in the infirmary, a sound that was interrupted by a low, rhythmic hammering, as if someone was sharpening a piece of scrap metal against the hull. The paranoia was no longer a feeling, it was a physical presence. It was the way the Henderson twins stood on opposite sides of the deck, watching the horizon, but never each other. It was the way Captain Barnes had bolted a piece of sheet metal over his cabin window. It was the way the light in the engine room kept failing, leaving the black, oily depths of the ship in total darkness. The gold was a magnet, and it was pulling all the iron in their souls to the surface. They were no longer waiting to get to Juneau. They were waiting for the lights to go out. They were waiting for the moment when the silence became too heavy to bear. Old Tom stayed in his galley, sharpening the last of the small paring knives. He wasn't arming himself for the fight. He was preparing for the aftermath, because Tom knew that when the screaming started, the man with the keys to the food and the water was the only one who would truly be rich. The Polar Star groaned as it climbed another massive wave. Underneath the sound of the wind, the shh, shh, shh of the whetstone continued. A countdown in steel.
The clock on the bulkhead in the engine room read 3 a.m., but time had no meaning anymore. There was only the heat, the vibration, and the overwhelming smell of grease and blood. The storm outside had reached its peak, forcing the Polar Star into a violent, sickening roll. And then, without warning, the world went black. The main generator, overworked and neglected, gave one final dying shudder and died. The hum that had been the heartbeat of the ship for years vanished, replaced by an agonizing, heavy silence, a silence that lasted only a heartbeat before the screaming began. In the pitch-black maze of the lower decks, the silent war became a literal slaughter. Without light, there were no faces, only shapes. There were no friends, only obstacles. "Who's there?" a voice shrieked. It sounded like one of the Henderson twins. The clatter of heavy boots on metal gratings echoed through the darkness. Clang, clang, clang. A frantic, desperate sound. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the gloom, its light dancing wildly as the ship pitched. In the strobe-like flashes, a nightmare was revealed. Big Mike, his leg bandaged and his eyes bloodshot with fever, was cornered against a massive intake pipe. In his hand was a heavy pipe wrench, dripping with something blacker than oil. Facing him were the twins, their silhouettes looking like twin demons in the flickering light, clutching the long, curved knives from the galley. "You won't get to the boats," Mike roared, his voice cracking. "None of you. If I don't get my share, I'm sinking this whole rusted bucket to the bottom." He swung the wrench with a grunt of pure, unadulterated rage. It struck a steam pipe with a deafening clang, releasing a cloud of scalding white vapor that filled the room. The screaming intensified. Through the mist, the flashlights caught glimpses of the carnage. It wasn't a fight, it was a butchery.
In the confined space of the engine room, there was no room to dodge, no room to breathe. The sound of metal hitting bone, the wet thud of a knife finding its mark, and the desperate gasps of dying men blended into a symphony of madness. Higher up, near the companionway, Billy Vance was crawling, his hands slick with oil and sweat. He could hear the fighting below, the animalistic grunts and the clashing of steel. He could hear the captain screaming orders from the bridge that no one was following. The gold, locked safely in the cabin above, had turned the ship into a pressurized cage, where the only way out was through the man standing in front of you. Cap stopped him, Billy cried out, but his voice was drowned by a massive wave hitting the hull, sending a shudder through the ship that threw him against a bulkhead. In the engine room, the flashlight was dropped. It spun on the floor, its beams circling the room like a lighthouse gone mad. For a split second, it illuminated the scene. Big Mike and one of the twins locked in a death grip, tumbling over the railing into the oily bilge water below. The other twin stood paralyzed, staring at his blood-slicked hands as the steam began to boil the air around him. There was no honor here, no grand purpose, just the raw, ugly reality of men who had traded their humanity for a promise of gold that was now 3 decks away and utterly useless. The Polar Star was pitching so violently now that the engines, unattended and overheating, began to groan in a way that signaled the end. In the dark, the gold didn't shine. It didn't provide warmth. It only provided a reason to die. By the time the emergency lights flickered into a dim, ghostly red, the engine room was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken bodies. The red gold of the Polar Star had claimed its first major payment. The water began to rise in the bilge, mixing with the spilled oil and the spilled life as the ship drifted deeper into the heart of the storm. The fire in their souls had burned the ship down from the inside, and as the screams faded into the moan of the wind, the only thing left was the rhythmic thump, thump of the dying engine, the ticking clock of a tragedy that was far from over.
The screaming in the engine room had stopped, replaced by a sound far more terrifying, the rhythmic, hollow glug, glug, glug of seawater rushing into the hull. The Polar Star was no longer a vessel. It was a dying animal, listing heavily to the starboard side, its iron ribs groaning under the immense pressure of the North Pacific. The emergency red lights flickered with a sickly, rhythmic pulse, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping hands on the bulkhead walls. Billy Vance dragged himself up the companionway, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. His hands were slick with a mixture of sea salt and something warm and thick that he didn't want to identify. Below him, the engine room was a dark, flooded pit. The flashlight that had been spinning on the floor was now submerged, glowing with a faint, ghostly blue light through 5 feet of oily water. Somewhere down there, in the cold dark, Big Mike and the Henderson twins had found their final share of the treasure. They were no longer rivals. They were just more weight pulling the ship down into the abyss. Captain Barnes!" Billy's voice was a high-pitched wail that echoed through the empty corridors. He reached the main deck, but the sight that met him was a vision of hell. The storm hadn't let up. The wind was a living thing, a predatory beast that tore at the rigging and sent sheets of freezing spray across the deck. The massive crab pots, once their livelihood, had broken loose from their moorings. They were sliding back and forth across the metal plates with every roll of the ship, crushing anything in their path with the force of a wrecking ball. Crunch, slide, crunch. Billy saw old Tom, the cook, standing near the lifeboat davits. The old man looked small, his white apron now a shredded gray rag flapping in the gale. He wasn't trying to lower the boat. He was just standing there, staring at the bridge, clutching a small canvas bag to his chest. "It's over, Billy," Tom shouted, though his voice sounded thin and distant, as if he were already speaking from the other side. "The mountain of gold has become an anchor. The ship is too heavy. She's going down, and she's taking the secrets with her." Billy ignored him and sprinted toward the captain's quarters. He had to see. He had to know. He burst through the door, which was hanging off its hinges. The cabin was a wreck. Books, charts, and empty scotch bottles were scattered across the floor, sliding in a pool of seawater. The safe, the heavy, iron heart of their greed, was wide open. Barnes was there. He was slumped against the bulkhead, his shotgun lying across his lap, his eyes fixed on the empty safe. He wasn't dead,
but the light had gone out of his soul. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun and gone blind. "It's gone, Billy," Barnes whispered, a strange, haunting smile touching his lips. "I tried to move it. I tried to get it to the boat, but it's too heavy. No one man can carry it. Not in this world." Billy looked toward the open door leading to the deck. He saw the trail, a heavy, gouged line in the wooden flooring where the canvas sacks had been dragged. It led straight to the railing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. In the madness of the blackout, someone had tried to steal the hoard, or perhaps, in a moment of final, clarity-driven insanity, someone had realized that the only way to save the ship was to give the gold back to the sea. But it was too late. The Polar Star gave a massive final shudder. A rogue wave, a wall of black water 70 feet high, emerged from the fog, looming over the ship like the hand of God. "Hold on!" Billy screamed, grabbing a railing, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of 1,000 tons of water. The chaos was no longer about the gold. It was about the next 5 seconds. The ship tilted, the deck vertical, and for a moment the world was nothing but white foam and the scream of twisting metal. The gold was gone, the crew was broken, and the Polar Star was finally surrendering to the cold, indifferent heart of the North.
The roar of the rogue wave subsided, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying. The Polar Star was no longer fighting the sea. She was wallowing in it, her decks awash with icy black water. The storm had mysteriously moved on, as if its only purpose had been to break the spirit of the ship. What remained was the fog, a thick, supernatural wall of gray that felt like damp wool against the skin. In the ghostly light of the pre-dawn, the silhouette of a single life raft bobbed rhythmically against the rusted hull. It was a fragile orange dot in a world of monochrome shadows. Billy Vance stood by the railing, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He was the only one left on deck. The captain was gone. Some say he stayed in his cabin to go down with his throne. Others say he simply walked into the waves. Old Tom was gone too, vanished into the mist like he had never existed. "Is anyone there?" Billy whispered, but the fog only echoed his own fear back at him. He looked down into the raft. There sat the last of the survivors, or what was left of them. 2 figures, huddled together, their faces obscured by the hoods of their oilskins. They didn't move. They didn't look up. Between them sat a single canvas sack, soaked and heavy, its bottom stained with the rust of the ship. It was the last of the gold, not the hoard they had dreamed of, but a fragment, a handful of bars that had cost them 11 lives. Billy climbed down the rope ladder, his fingers so numb they felt like wooden pegs. As he dropped into the raft, the vessel groaned one last time behind him. It was a long, metallic sigh, the sound of air escaping the hull as the water finally claimed the engine room. "We have to row," Billy said, grabbing the plastic oars. "If we stay near the suction, she'll pull us down." The figures didn't answer. As Billy began to pull against the black water, the Polar Star began her final descent. She didn't sink with a roar. She slipped away quietly, the stern rising slowly into the air like a giant tombstone before sliding beneath the surface. A few bubbles, a slick of oil, and a scattering of wooden crates were all that remained of the Brotherhood of Iron. The raft drifted into the heart of the fog. Billy rowed until his muscles screamed, until his vision blurred, but the horizon never appeared. There was no north, no south, only the gray. "We are rich now, right?" Billy asked, a hysterical edge to his voice. He looked at the 2 figures. "We made it. We are the lucky ones." He reached out to pull back the hood of the nearest figure. His heart stopped. It wasn't Big Mike. It wasn't a twin. It was a hollow shell of oilskin, propped up by a wooden crate. The raft was empty. He had been talking to shadows. The weight of the canvas sack at the bottom of the boat seemed to grow. In the absolute silence of the Gulf, Billy realized the truth. The gold hadn't been saved. It was just being transported to a deeper grave. As the fog swallowed the raft, the sound of the oars hitting the water began slower and slower, until there was nothing left but the sound of the tide. In 1974, the Polar Star was reported missing.
No debris was ever found. No bodies ever washed ashore. The gold of Orca Bay had found its final keepers, and the fog of Alaska never tells its secrets to the living.
3 days later, the fog finally lifted, stripped away by a cold, surgical wind from the north. That was when the Coast Guard cutter Ironwood spotted her. The Polar Star hadn't sunk. Not entirely. She was riding low in the water, a rusted iron carcass listing 30 degrees to starboard, drifting aimlessly into the shipping lanes like a ghost seeking a harbor. When the boarding party stepped onto the deck, they didn't find a battlefield. They found a museum of madness. "Watch his step," Officer Vance barked, his voice echoing hollowly against the steel plates. The deck was covered in a thin, translucent sheet of ice, frozen seawater that had preserved the chaos in a crystal tomb. The first thing they noticed were the crab pots. They weren't stacked, they were scattered, some crushed as if a giant hand had squeezed them. And among the tangled netting and broken shells, they found the boots, empty, salt-stained rubber boots, standing perfectly upright on the deck, as if their owners had simply evaporated out of them. They moved toward the bridge. The heavy steel door was locked from the inside. When they finally forced it open with a hydraulic spreader, the sound of the metal snapping was like a gunshot. Inside, the wheelhouse was pristine. The brass was polished. The charts were neatly folded. But the radio, the lifeline to the world, had been systematically smashed with a heavy object, not by the storm, but by a human hand. The wires hung from the console like severed nerves. "Check the captain's quarters," Vance ordered, his hand hovering over his sidearm. The air inside the ship was stagnant, smelling of old grease and something sweet, the cloying, sickly scent of rot hidden by the cold. The trail began in the hallway. It wasn't a trail of blood. The ice and the seawater had washed most of that away. It was a trail of gouges, deep, violent scars in the linoleum floor, as if heavy crates had been dragged by men who were losing their grip. They found the safe in the captain's cabin. The door was swung wide, its heavy bolts sheared. It was empty. But it wasn't the emptiness that chilled the officers to the bone. It was the floor. Surrounding the safe were hundreds of small, golden flakes, shavings of gold that had been filed away in a frantic, desperate hurry. It looked like golden snow. "Sir, you need to see the engine room," a voice crackled over the radio. It was the young ensign, his voice trembling with a raw, primal fear. Vance descended the narrow stairs. The lower decks were flooded with 3 feet of black, oily water. As his flashlight beam cut through the dark, he saw them. Shadows beneath the surface. The bodies weren't floating, they were pinned. Big Mike and one of the twins were locked in a frozen embrace at the bottom of the stairs, their hands still gripped around each other's throats, their eyes open and clouded by the brine. They had died fighting for a treasure that was now nowhere to be found. There was no gold on the ship, no logs, no survivors. On the galley table, they found a single plate of beef stew, frozen solid. Beside it, a cigarette had burned a long, black scar into the wood before going out. It was a scene of a life interrupted, not by a disaster from the outside, but by a poison from within. "What happened here?" the ensign whispered, looking at the carnage. Vance looked at the empty safe, then at the golden shavings on the floor. He thought about the 12 men who had been friends for a decade. "Greed happened," Vance replied, his voice flat. "The sea gave them everything they ever wanted, and then it sat back and watched them kill each other for it." The Polar Star was towed back to Kodiak, but she never felt empty. The investigator spoke of hearing footsteps in the night, of the smell of tobacco smoke in the galley, and of a low, rhythmic scratching sound coming from inside the safe. The official report listed the cause as internal strife and heavy weather, but in the bars of Anchorage, they tell a different story. They say the gold is still out there, drifting in a small orange raft that no radar can see. A raft steered by a man who no longer has a name.
They say that when a person leaves a room in a hurry, they leave a part of their soul behind. On the Polar Star, the souls of 12 men were trapped in the mundane objects they touched every day, relics of a life that was discarded the moment the gold hit the deck. These weren't the artifacts of criminals, they were the belongings of fathers, sons, and brothers who had simply lost their way in the dark. In the crew's quarters, the bunks remained unmade, the blankets tossed aside as if their occupants had just stepped out for a cigarette. On the edge of Billy Vance's bunk, pinned to the rusted bulkhead with a piece of gray duct tape, was the Polaroid. It was a picture of a girl in a summer dress, standing in front of a blooming fireweed patch in Anchorage. Her smile was bright, frozen in a world where the sea was just a place where her boyfriend went to work. Beside it, Billy had started a letter. "Dear Claire," it began, the ink smeared by a drop of salt water. "The haul is good. This might be the last time I have to leave you." He was right, but for all the wrong reasons. The letter ended there, the pen lying on the floor, its ink dried in a final, jagged line. Move to the galley, and the ghosts become even louder. On the counter sat old Tom's glasses, the frames bent, one lens cracked. Beside them was a small wooden carving, a tiny half-finished whale he had been whittling for his grandson. The wood was cedar, smelling faintly of the forests they would never see again. The shavings were scattered on the floor, mixed with the golden dust that had drifted in from the captain's cabin. A life's work, a family's hope, abandoned for a metal that couldn't even keep them warm. In Big Mike's locker, there was a stack of open envelopes, bills from a hospital in Seattle, marked overdue. Mike hadn't been fighting for luxury, he had been fighting for a way out of a hole that was deeper than the ocean. There was a worn Bible, too, its pages thin as onion skin. A pressed clover was tucked into the book of Job. It was a reminder that even the strongest man on the ship was looking for a sign, a bit of luck to change the tide of a hard life. The ship's log sat on the chart table, its leather cover cracked by the cold. Captain Barnes had kept it meticulously for 20 years, but the last 3 pages were a descent into madness. The handwriting, once steady and precise, had become a frantic scrawl. There were no more coordinates, no more weather reports, just numbers, calculations of weights, purities, and shares. In the margins he had doodled a crown, the same crown from the Spanish coins, over and over again, until the ink tore through the paper. On a hook behind the door hung a yellow oilskin jacket. It was heavy, encrusted with salt, and still held the shape of the man who wore it. In the pocket there was a handful of coins, not Spanish gold, but ordinary American quarters and dimes, the pocket change of a working man. It was a haunting reminder of who they were before the fever took them. They were men who counted their pennies, who saved for a beer on Saturday night, who valued the simple weight of honest work. The investigators found a half-played cassette tape in the crew's common room. When they pressed play, the thin, tinny sound of a 1974 folk song filled the dead ship, a song about coming home, about the green grass of home. The music echoed through the empty corridors, bouncing off the blood-stained steel and the empty safe. It was a cruel irony, a melody of belonging playing for a crew that would never belong anywhere again. These details, the half-finished letter, the carved whale, the overdue bills, are the true tragedy of the Polar Star. The gold was just a catalyst. The real story was written in the things they left behind. They weren't monsters. They were just men who let a glimmer of light blind them to the value of the lives they already had. As the ironwood towed the silent ship toward the horizon, the wind caught a loose page from Billy's letter, blowing it out into the gray Alaskan mist. It fluttered for a moment like a white bird before touching the water and vanishing. The North had claimed the men, and now it was erasing the evidence that they had ever loved at all.
The year is now far beyond 1974, but in the Gulf of Alaska, time does not move in years, it moves in tides. The waves that broke the Polar Star have long since reached the shore, turned into foam, and retreated back into the deep. The rust that ate her hull has become part of the salt, and the bones of the 12 men have been claimed by the silent, slow-moving currents of the abyss. If you were to fly over Orca Bay today, you would see nothing but the restless, iron-gray surface of the water. There are no monuments here, no plaques to mark the spot where a brotherhood was traded for a handful of Spanish gold. The ocean does not build monuments to human folly, it simply erases the evidence. The coordinates, 59 degrees north, 146 degrees west, mark a patch of water that looks like any other. But deep beneath, in the crushing pressure of the lifeless zone, the Polar Star remains. She is a reef of twisted metal now, a playground for deep-sea creatures that have no use for gold. The safe is still there, its doors swinging rhythmically with the underwater tides, echoing a sound that no one will ever hear. Clang, clang, clang. A heartbeat in a graveyard of silt. In the coastal towns of the North, the story has faded into a campfire legend, a warning whispered to young greenhorns before their first season. They are told to watch the weather, to check their gear, and to never, ever look too closely at what the nets bring up from the very bottom, because some treasures are better left in the dark. The fog still rolls in every October,
thick and suffocating, just as it did that night in '74. And some sailors, men who have spent too much time alone on the night watch, claim they still see a faint orange glow drifting through the mist. They say it's the light of a single lantern on a small raft, steered by a boy who is still trying to find his way back to Anchorage, back to a girl who stopped waiting decades ago. But it's likely just the northern lights reflecting off the ice, or perhaps it's just the mind playing tricks in the vast, lonely silence of the edge of the world. The gold of the Nuestra Senora is still out there. It's always out there, waiting for the next storm, the next ship, and the next heart to find its crack. The North doesn't change, and human nature doesn't change. We are all just sailors on a fragile boat, drifting over a treasure we can't keep. The screen fades to black, but the sound of the wind remains for a few seconds longer, a cold, hollow whistle that sounds like a name being called across the water. Then finally, there is only the sound of the waves. The sea has the last word. It always has the last word.